It was early June 1997. The sun was rising over the turquoise waters of Playa del Carmen, a small fishing village in the heart of the Mexican Caribbean that was beginning to transform into the famous tourist destination we know today. The streets were still packed with hard-packed sand, the coconut trees swayed in the warm, salty breeze, and the sound of the waves mingled with the laughter of families enjoying the summer. Back then, the place still retained the simple, welcoming essence of a community where everyone knew each other by name and where life flowed at a leisurely pace, guided by the ebb and flow of the sea. Among the visitors who arrived each year was the Morales Herrera family. From Mérida, Arturo, the father, was an architect and saw these trips as an opportunity to escape the stress of work. Elena, his wifing, was a librarian, a calm and observant woman, passionate about books and the sound of the ocean. Their two daughters completed the perfect picture of family happiness. Itzel, just 7 years old, curious and full of energy, and Sofia, the youngest of 4, who followed her sister everywhere like a loving little shadow. Vacations in Playa del Carmen had been a tradition since 1994. Each summer, the family rented the same simple turquoise-painted cabin, just 2 blocks from the beach. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the distant sound of seagulls. Arturo read the newspaper on the porch while Elena prepared breakfast. Itzel, with her bright, restless eyes, was already asking 1,000 questions about the world around her, about the shells, the crabs, the starfish. She was a girl who not only observed but also wanted to understand every mystery the sea held. Her curiosity and imagination brought to life every grain of sand and every wave that crashed on the shore. What no one could have imagined was that seemingly ordinary summer would mark the beginning of one of the most intriguing and moving cases in recent Mexican history, an episode that would begin with the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of a child and end in a way no one could have predicted. If you're enjoying the beginning of this story, subscribe to the channel, like it, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters of this true and surprising narrative. Tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. We want to know how far this story goes. And stay until the end because what follows will captivate you from beginning to end. June 12, 1997, dawned sultry and humid, typical of summer on the Mexican Caribbean coast. The wind blew lazily, and a light mist drifting in from the sea seemed to herald another peaceful day in Playa del Carmen. Arturo Morales woke early, determined to fulfill the promise he'd made to his daughter the night before, to take Itzel to the beach to look for hermit crabs before the sun got too strong and the tourists filled the sand. The clock read 6:30 when he got up quietly, trying not to wake the girls. However, upon entering the small room where the two slept, something immediately struck her as wrong. Sofia was still fast asleep, curled up on her pillow, but Itzel's bed was empty. The blankets, crumpled and cold, indicated she had left some time ago. Arturo called her name, first softly, then with increasing urgency. No response. Elena, awakened by her husband's voice, ran to the room. One look was enough to tell something was out of the ordinary. They searched the entire cabin, the bathroom, the kitchen, the small wooden porch. Nothing. The front door was just ajar, with the bolt removed. Unusual, since the family always kept it locked at night. Elena's heart began to race, and Arturo's voice, calling for his daughter, grew more strained with each attempt. Within minutes, the tranquility of dawn gave way to an anguish that seemed to grow with every breath. Arturo ran to the beach, calling his daughter's name over the sound of the waves and the wind. Seagulls circled the sea, oblivious to the distress beginning to grip that stretch of sand. At that hour, a few fishermen were already on the pier, preparing their nets for the day's work. Noticing the man's desperation, they dropped what they were doing and joined the search. Among them was Miguel Vargas, an experienced fisherman known to everyone in the village. He listened attentively to Arturo's description. A 7-year-old girl with shoulder-length brown hair, large, lively eyes, and perhaps still wearing pink pajamas with small white stars. Meanwhile, Elena roamed the streets near the cabin, calling out for Itzel and showing a recent photograph to anyone she met. Her neighbors, the Solis family, an elderly couple who rented houses in the area, were the first to realize the gravity of the situation. Donna Carmen Solis, still in her nightclothes, began knocking on doors, asking other residents for help. Soon, an impromptu search party formed. Some continued along the beach, others spread out through the sandy alleys, while Elena fought back tears so as not to scare little Sofia, who accompanied her, not fully understanding what was happening. At 7:30 in the morning, The heat was beginning to set in. Arturo, panting, walked the same route they had taken the day before, to the area where Itzel had spent hours watching crabs on the rocks. He called out to her nonstop, but the only sound he heard was the crashing of the waves. One of the fishermen found a pink children's sandal among the rocks, stuck between two rocks. Arturo recognized it immediately. It was Itzel's. The sandal was wet and covered in sand. The sight of that small object loose among the rocks cut through the air like a knife. The group intensified the search. Some fishermen went out to sea. Others followed in small boats to search the area near the coast. Don Miguel, who was familiar with the local currents, explained that at that time of day the tide was low and there was no danger of strong drag. This made it unlikely that the girl had been swept away by the sea, unless she had fallen and seriously injured herself. Elena arrived at the scene shortly after, and when she saw the sandal, she lost her strength. Arturo held her, trying to remain calm, but his eyes betrayed growing desperation. Around 10 in the morning, after more than 3 hours of fruitless searching, someone suggested calling the police. Don Miguel used the radio on one of the boats to contact the nearest police station. Half an hour later, a white pickup truck bearing the municipal police emblem arrived, kicking up dust. Out stepped Commander Ramiro Soto, a middle-aged, experienced man with a firm gaze and an authoritative demeanor. As soon as he assessed the situation, he took command of the operation. Soto asked everyone present to report what they knew, carefully recording every detail in his notebook. He asked about the girl's routine, her habits, and whether she had shown any interest in exploring other places. Elena, still trembling, said that Itzel was curious but obedient, and that she would never have wandered off alone without a compelling reason. He also mentioned that the day before, the girl had talked a lot about the freshwater lagoon at the northern end of the beach, a place she called her secret place. The commander decided to direct part of the team in that direction. The group split up. Some followed the coast. Others advanced through the shallow forest and mangroves surrounding the lagoon. The terrain was treacherous, with holes, roots, and slippery rocks. As they walked, the sun rose relentlessly, and the air grew heavy. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the caw of a bird, made the volunteers' hearts race, but nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated the presence of a child. No sound of crying, no trace of fresh footprints. As the hours passed, new hypotheses began to emerge. Some believed Itzel had gotten lost and might be hiding somewhere more remote. Others, more skeptical, began to fear the worst. Commander Soto, experienced in missing person cases, kept a cool head. He knew the first 12 hours were crucial. He ordered a preliminary report prepared and ordered authorities in Cancun and Cozumel to be notified if anyone spotted a child with similar characteristics. The entire village got involved. Women prepared food and water for the searchers, while fishermen used their boats to patrol the shore. By dusk, the small, normally peaceful village was gripped by a tense silence, broken only by the voices still calling for Itzel on the wind. Even exhausted and afraid, Arturo refused to stop. He continued walking through the sand, examining every footprint, every mark, trying to find any sign of his daughter. Elena, exhausted, remained in the hut, holding the sandal she'd found as if it were an extension of her. Sophia slept in Mrs. Solis's lap, unable to understand why her mother's face was so pale. That night, when Commander Soto returned to the cabin to report that the search would continue the next day with the support of other officers, a feeling of disbelief and despair hung over everyone. No one could accept that in such a small and familiar place, a child could simply disappear without a trace. The sea, which for years had been the setting for the Morales Herrera family's happiest memories, now seemed to hide a deep and disturbing secret, and as darkness covered Playa del Carmen, the murmur of the waves seemed to repeat the same name that echoed in everyone's mind. Itzel. The days following Itzel's disappearance turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. When the calendar finally marked the end of that summer of 1997, the Morales Herrera family was no longer the same. The hope that initially led them to believe the girl could appear at any moment began to mix with the dull pain of uncertainty. At the end of 2 intense weeks of searching in Playa del Carmen, Commander Soto recommended that the family return to Mérida. The investigation would continue, but there was nothing more they could do there, at least for now. The return trip was silent. The journey, which in other years would have been filled with laughter and music in the car, now seemed endless. Sophia, just 4 years old, looked out the window, asking when they would return for her sister. Elena couldn't find the strength to answer. She simply held her daughter's hand, trying to hold back her tears. Arturo, focused on the road, kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if driving were the only way to keep from collapsing. In Mérida, everything seemed the same, yet completely different. Itzel's room remained tidy, as if she would return at any moment. Her toys, her shells, her small, childish notes were untouched. Elena couldn't enter the room without feeling a tightness in her chest. For weeks, she avoided even going through the door. Arturo, on the other hand, transformed the space into a refuge for searching. It was there that he kept copies of police reports, maps, notes, and photographs. Each new day became a routine of calls, contacts, and pleas for help. He believed that somewhere, someone knew something, and if he persisted enough, he would eventually find the answer. The first few months were the most brutal. Every phone call made Elena's heart race. Every knock on the door brought a glimmer of hope. Often, it was just neighbors offering support, but sometimes, it was the police with a new lead that, within hours, turned out to be unfounded. The local press began following the case, publishing articles and appealing for information. Radio stations across the Yucatan Peninsula repeated Itzel's name daily, describing her, and asking anyone who had seen a girl with those characteristics to contact them. Still, no concrete answers emerged. Arturo traveled back to Playa del Carmen countless times, trying to relive every detail, talking to fishermen and locals, revisiting the spot where he found the sandal. Each time he returned, he brought new notes, new hypotheses, new maps with red circles marking search areas. To many, it seemed like an obsession. For him, it was a form of survival. Elena, for her part, faced her suffering more silently. She returned to work at the municipal library, trying to cling to her routine so as not to lose control. Between books and shelves, she tried to hide the pain that accompanied her every minute. Sometimes, in the middle of her shift, some childish sound or word would remind her of Itzel's voice, and she would have to step away for a few minutes to contain her tears. Sophia, too young to understand, began expressing her confusion in other ways. She began to have frequent nightmares and would cry when her parents left the house, fearing they would disappear too. Time marched on, but in the Morales Herrera household, the clocks seemed to tell it differently. The dates blurred together, the days seemed the same, and Itzel's absence made the air heavy. Still, hope persisted. For each of the girls' birthdays, Elena baked a small cake and lit a candle. Arturo hung a photo of his daughter on the balcony and promised himself he would never let the case fade into oblivion. In 1998, a news story briefly rekindled hope. A tourist claimed to have seen a girl resembling Itzel in Cancun, accompanied by a woman. Arturo traveled immediately, without even thinking. He spent 2 days searching hotels, markets, and streets, but discovered that the girl he had seen was another child, the daughter of a local family. This type of mistake would be repeated several times in the following years, and each one left deeper scars. Commander Soto, faithful to his promise to the family, maintained frequent contact. He called periodically, updating them on new investigations. Even though more often than not, the content was disappointing. The case had also been referred to state authorities, and for a time, there seemed to be a network of efforts. However, as the years passed, police interest waned, and the reports began to become less detailed. Arturo's routine became a combination of work and research. At the office, he was known for his discipline, but everyone knew that on his desk sat a blue folder with the name Itzel, handwritten on it. In it, he kept newspaper clippings, detective contacts, and every new report the police sent. At night, he spent hours poring over the documents, trying to find patterns, retracing timelines, convinced there was something everyone was missing. Elena immersed herself in reading about child psychology, perhaps seeking to understand what her daughter might be feeling, wherever she was. Later, this would lead her to specialize in the field, but at that moment, it was simply an attempt to maintain her connection with her daughter. Sophia grew up under the weight of silence. At school parties, it was common to see parents moved by their children's performances. Elena and Arturo watched with restrained smiles, imagining what it would be like if Itzel were there too. Every birthday, the family returned to Playa del Carmen. They visited the beach, brought flowers to the spot where they found the sandal, and sat in silence, gazing out at the sea. It was a painful but necessary ritual. There, they felt a part of Itzel still present, As if the wind from the ocean carried something of her. The years passed, and the world kept turning. The internet was becoming more popular. New technologies were emerging. But for the Morales Herreras, time remained stuck in 1997. The nights were still long and the memories were clear. Every time Arturo saw a girl Itzel's age, his heart sank. Elena, for her part, had learned to smile in public. But inside, she lived in constant fear. Their grief was what psychologists would later call ambiguous grief, a pain that cannot be resolved because there is no body, no certainty, only absence. They could neither bury a memory nor move on completely. They lived between two worlds, that of hope and that of loss, without fully belonging to either. In 2001, Arturo and Elena decided to create a small support group with other families who had also lost children in similar circumstances. They met once a month to exchange information, comfort each other, and, most importantly, keep the flame of the search alive. It was in this circle that they found solace and realized they were not alone. Each story was an open wound, but also a reminder that they must endure. Time, however, didn't erase the emptiness. Itzel remained alive in conversations, photographs, memories, but also in silence. And as the years passed, Arturo and Elena began to understand that absence could be as powerful as presence. Life went on, but the search never ended. Time had become a silent enemy in the lives of the Morales Herrera family. More than 10 years had passed since Itzel's disappearance, and although routine seemed to have returned to normal for the world around them, inside their house in Mérida, time was still stuck in 1997. Elena and Arturo had learned to live with the emptiness, but hope persisted, a flame that, however weak, never completely extinguished. In 2008, an unexpected call brutally rekindled that hope. A young woman had been detained in Monterrey for involvement in petty crimes, and during the trial, she claimed to remember nothing of her childhood before the age of 10. Authorities, following protocol, compared her physical characteristics with missing child records. Itzel Morales' name emerged among the possible matches. When Arturo answered the phone and heard the words, "There may be a match for your daughter," his legs felt weak. After more than a decade, there was a new chance, and with it, the fear of reliving the same despair. The couple immediately traveled to Monterrey. The anxiety on the way was unbearable. Elena alternated between faith and fear that everything would end in disappointment again. Upon arrival, they were taken to the police station, where they found a young woman of approximately 18, with brown hair and a serene expression. For a few moments, Elena believed she saw the reflection of her adult daughter. The girl, however, showed no recognition. The conversation was brief and painful. Hope was sustained until DNA tests brought cold, definitive confirmation. There was no biological relationship between them. Once again, the ground gave way beneath their feet. Despite the pain, that episode had an unexpected effect. It brought Itzel's case back to the forefront, rekindling media attention and, with it, the solidarity of other families in similar situations. Arturo and Elena were contacted by parents also experiencing the torment of searching for missing children. From this contact, an informal network of support and information exchange grew. The couple began participating in meetings, lectures, and radio programs, telling their story and helping others bear the weight of uncertainty. Gradually, they became a reference point, a symbol of resilience and perseverance. Over the years, communication tools began to change the way searches were conducted. In 2010, Arturo discovered the power of social media. He created a page dedicated to his daughter, with old photographs, descriptions, and updates on the investigation. The internet then became a new territory of hope. People from different regions sent messages saying they had seen similar girls, or shared posts with the hashtag, "We are looking for Itzel." Connections multiplied quickly, and each new notification was seen as a possible signal. Elena, who initially resisted the idea of exposing her family's pain publicly, eventually realized the impact of digital reach. Soon, Itzel's story began circulating on missing persons forums, news websites, and even international groups dedicated to family reunification. Some contacts were fake, others well-intentioned, but all demanded attention. Each message received was read carefully, each photograph compared with the features of the girl they had lost so many years ago. Between 2011 and 2013, several reports of possible sightings emerged. In Guadalajara, a young woman said she believed she had been illegally adopted and lacked legitimate birth documents. In Oaxaca, A woman claimed to have seen a young woman who looked very similar to Itzel working at a guest house. In Cancun, a Brazilian tourist sent a photo of a young woman who, he said, had the same smile as the missing girl. Arturo investigated every lead, spending his savings on trips, phone calls, and meetings. The pattern repeated itself. Hope, expectation, and finally, frustration. No concrete results. Meanwhile, Sophia, now an adult and studying psychology, was going through a complex process of understanding her own identity. She had grown up with her sister's absence as a constant shadow, and even as she tried to move on, she felt that a part of her story remained incomplete. She participated in online campaigns and helped manage the family page, responding to messages and coordinating new posts. It was her way of staying close to Itzel, even without knowing her anymore. In 2012, Arturo took early retirement. He decided to dedicate his full time to searching for and supporting other families. He volunteered with organizations working on missing persons and helped create a community database of missing children in the Yucatan Peninsula. Elena, meanwhile, pursued an academic path, completing a postgraduate degree in child psychology with a focus on trauma and grief. Her work was recognized by her peers, and she began working with families in similar situations. It was a way to transform pain into purpose. During these years, the Morales home became a veritable information hub. Maps, newspaper clippings, and boxes of reports filled an entire room. Arturo meticulously recorded everything. Every call received, every name mentioned, every new lead investigated. Even with so many failures, he never considered giving up. For him, each attempt was a promise of fidelity to his daughter. The couple's faith, however, was not blind. They knew their chances diminished with each passing year, but they also believed that unlikely stories could have surprising endings. And when fatigue threatened to overwhelm them, all they had to do was look at old photos to remember the reason to keep fighting. The image of Itzel, smiling on the beach, her hands full of seashells, was the fuel that kept them going. The community began to see the Morales family as an example of unconditional love and perseverance. Local newspapers and television programs began to interview them again. In each appearance, Arturo repeated the same phrase, "As long as there is no certainty, there is hope." This conviction began to inspire other families experiencing the same torment, and Itzel's story came to represent more than an individual quest. It became a collective symbol of the fight against oblivion. However, what no one could have predicted was that, after so many years of frustration and false leads, a simple chance encounter in front of a television camera would change the course of this story forever. But that was still to come. Until that moment, what drove Arturo, Elena, and Sophia was the same feeling that had accompanied them since 1997, the unshakable faith that, somewhere, Itzel still existed, waiting to be found. That November night in 2015, the Morales household in Merida was quiet. Elena prepared dinner while the television played the local news, a background noise filling the silence. It was a habit she'd acquired over the years, watching the news in the hope of seeing a case that might somehow yield new clues about missing people. As she chopped vegetables in the kitchen, she heard the anchor announce a report about a job fair taking place in Mexico City. The segment seemed trivial, featuring young candidates and companies offering positions. But something on the screen almost instinctively caught Elena's attention. Among the anonymous faces the camera showed, a young woman of about 25 emerged, with shoulder-length brown hair and a concentrated gaze as she filled out a form. The frame lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to paralyze Elena. There was something about that face, the shape of her eyes, the subtle smile, even the small movement of her hands as she adjusted her hair, that provoked a feeling she couldn't ignore. The reporter asked the woman's name, and the answer came clearly: Lucia Mendoza. The voice, mature yet familiar, seemed to echo from the past. Time seemed to stand still. Elena felt her body tremble and dropped the knife on the counter. She ran into the living room, turned up the volume, and stood in front of the screen, mesmerized. The interview lasted a little over 2 minutes, but each second was like a blow to the heart. By the time the reporter thanked the interviewee and the camera pulled away, Elena was already crying. The image of that young woman rekindled something she thought was dormant, a maternal conviction, that silent certainty that no rational proof can explain. "It's her," she whispered to herself. "It's my daughter." Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called Arturo, who was at a meeting of the support group for families of the missing. Her voice, thick with emotion and disbelief, made him rush home. When he arrived, he found his wife in front of the television, replaying the video recorded on the local news. "Look closely, Arturo," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's not just the features. It's the way, the look. It's our Itzel." Arturo watched cautiously. Years of disappointment had taught him to restrain hope, but as the video progressed, something inside him began to waver. There was a familiarity in the gestures, a subtlety that not even time could erase. The next day, the couple contacted the network responsible for the program. They were contacted by a producer who, touched by the story, confirmed that the recording had been made during a job fair at the Mexico City Convention Center. He also said he could provide the name of the company where Lucia Mendoza had applied, though he made it clear that there were legal limits on personal information. Still, this small clue was enough. Arturo called an old acquaintance, Javier Rios, a private detective who had worked with the family years before. Javier listened attentively to the description and, although accustomed to dealing with hopeful parents, admitted that the case had compelling peculiarities. With the name and location of the fair, he began a discreet investigation. Within a few days, he located the registration of a candidate named Lucia Mendoza, born in 1990, the same year as Itzel, and who worked temporary jobs in customer service. According to the information obtained, she lived alone in an apartment in Colonia Roma Norte, a busy area of the capital. The detective advised caution. If the young woman really was Itzel, direct contact could cause confusion and resistance. He then proposed a first covert meeting, under the pretext of researching the job market. Elena and Arturo agreed, though anxiety made it impossible to sleep that week. When the day arrived, they were in a discreet cafe in Roma Norte, sitting a few meters away from Javier, who was chatting with Lucia. The young woman entered punctually, dressed simply but with a serene air. The moment they saw her, Elena and Arturo gasped. The way she walked, the way she arranged the objects on the table before sitting down, even her small habit of biting her lower lip when she thought, everything directly reminded her of the girl they had lost. Javier led the conversation naturally, asking about her childhood and life story. Lucia replied that she had been raised by a woman named Marta Garcia, who claimed to be her aunt but had never told him much about her early years. He also said that, since childhood, he had had recurring dreams of the sea, although he had never lived near the coast. Elena, watching from a few feet away, felt her body shiver. There was no longer any doubt. The coincidences were too many to be mere chance. When Javier judged the moment was right, he delicately explained the true reason for their meeting. He told her that there was a family searching for their daughter who had disappeared 18 years ago, and that there were striking similarities between their story and Lucia's. The young woman remained silent for long seconds, staring at him, until she asked in a trembling voice, "Where are these people?" Elena stood up, unable to contain herself any longer. She approached the table and, her heart racing, said, "It's me. I'm that girl's mother." Lucia stared at her with teary eyes, as if fighting something bubbling in her memory. Arturo approached slowly, holding an old photograph, the image of Itzel smiling on the beach, clutching a handful of shells. Lucia brought her hand to her mouth in surprise. "I have a box of shells just like those," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I always thought they were important, but I never knew why." Emotion gripped everyone. No words would be enough to explain that moment. There was no scientific certainty yet, but there was something stronger than any data. The silent recognition between souls who knew each other. Still, it was necessary to confirm the impossible. That same afternoon, Javier scheduled a DNA test at an accredited laboratory. The samples were carefully collected, and the results would be delivered within a week. It was an interminable 7 days. The family stayed in a hotel near the laboratory, trying to contain their anxiety. Lucia, confused, spent part of the time with them, listening to stories from Itzel's childhood and sharing fragmented memories of her own life. Each conversation revealed new parallels: a love of organizing objects, a fascination with marine animals, a habit of collecting small stones. Arturo saw in these details confirmation of something science had yet to prove. When the results were finally ready, everyone gathered in the detective's office. The expert opened the envelope and read the technical report in a neutral voice. Probability of genetic compatibility, 99.7%. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena brought her hands to her face and wept. Arturo closed his eyes, as if he could finally breathe after 18 years. Lucia, stunned, looked at them and simply whispered, "So it's true." But the reunion, though confirmed by science, was just beginning. There were still unanswered questions. memories to reconstruct, and a long and painful story to be told. After scientific confirmation that Lucia Mendoza was, in fact, Itzel Morales Herrera, a new chapter began for everyone involved. The joy of their reunion gave way to an urgent need to understand what had really happened that morning of June 12, 1997. For 18 years, Itzel's life, or Lucia, as she had been called since childhood, had been divided into two worlds, separated by a silence that now needed to be broken. Detective Javier Rios took on the investigation with the same rigor with which he had conducted the search. His goal was not only to fill in the gaps in the story, but to reconstruct every detail, every step that had led a girl who disappeared in Playa del Carmen to reappear as a young adult living in Puebla under a different identity. Lucia cooperated from the very beginning. She wanted answers as much as her parents did. She carried a confused sense of loyalty. She loved the woman who had raised her, but she needed to understand what had been denied her for all those years. The first discoveries came through work records and medical records. Javier located old documents showing that Marta Garcia had worked as a maid in various residences and hotels in the Riviera Maya during the 1990s. Cross-referencing dates, he discovered something crucial. Marta was employed at a resort a few kilometers from the beach where Itzel had disappeared, on the exact same dates as the incident. In statements, co-workers recalled that she had abruptly left her job at the end of June of that year, saying she needed to take care of a young girl in the family. Based on these accounts, Javier reconstructed a plausible hypothesis. On the morning of her disappearance, Marta had found Itzel wandering the beach, disoriented, likely after a fall. Medical records later found confirmed that same morning, Marta had taken a child of about 7 years old to a small local clinic in Playa del Carmen, claiming to be her aunt. The medical records mentioned a bruise on the head and symptoms consistent with partial amnesia. The doctor had recommended rest and monitoring, but hadn't suspected anything out of the ordinary. The most disturbing piece of the puzzle came from the testimonies of Marta's former neighbors in Puebla. They all remembered when she returned from her Caribbean vacation, accompanied by a little girl. She said she was her niece, the daughter of a sister who had died in an accident. No one questioned her. Marta was a reserved, hard-working, and respected woman. She lived discreetly, devoting herself entirely to the child. Neighbors recalled how affectionate she was, but also overly protective, preventing the girl from approaching strangers or asking questions about her past. As the investigation progressed, Marta Garcia's character became more complex. She wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. She had a history of devastating loss. She had lost her own daughter, a similar age to Itzel, in a car accident in 1994. After that episode, according to testimonies, she plunged into a deep sadness. Some said she never recovered emotionally. It's likely that in finding a child alone, injured and without memories, Marta saw a second chance, a way to fill the void that tormented her. Elena, upon hearing this explanation, was overcome with conflicting feelings. Part of her wanted to hate that woman for having taken nearly 2 decades of her family's life away from her, but as the information emerged, another feeling began to emerge: compassion. Marta hadn't acted out of malice or greed. She hadn't asked for a ransom, nor had she deliberately tried to hide the girl from the world. Her actions had been born from the desperation of a mother who had lost everything, and, in a way, she had also given Itzel love, education, and protection. Itzel, for her part, struggled to reconcile the two parts of her identity. The woman who had raised her, whom she had called aunt for so many years, was now also responsible for separating her from her real family. She remembered Marta as affectionate but silent, a woman who avoided talking about the past and always answered questions with vague phrases. "Your mother died young," she would say, "but you were lucky to have me." Now, Itzel understood that these answers were echoes of a guilt Marta had carried until her death. Little by little, small fragments of memory began to resurface: the smell of wet sand, the sound of seagulls, the rough touch of her father's hand. Disjointed memories, sensations that hadn't made sense until that moment. During sessions with a psychologist specializing in trauma and memory recovery, Itzel began to understand that she had developed a form of dissociative amnesia after the accident and disappearance. The trauma of being lost, combined with the confusion and lack of family references, had erased part of her childhood from her mind. Marta, instead of seeking help or reporting the incident, chose to remain silent and build a new life around lies. Authorities, upon reopening the case based on new evidence, confirmed the forged identity documents. The birth certificate used by Marta had only been issued in 1999, with manipulated information and false witnesses. A system failure, typical of the time, allowed the fraud to continue for years. Investigations revealed that Marta was never involved in trafficking or illegal adoption. Her motivation appeared to be purely emotional. Even so, the impact of her actions was immeasurable. Arturo reacted with more anger than Elena. For him, each lost year represented a stolen childhood, a youth he couldn't share. But even amid the pain, there was a sense of human tragedy that made it impossible to completely hate this woman. She loved her in her own way, Elena once said, looking at one of Marta's old photos found during the investigation. But her love was built on deception. Reconstructing the truth revealed not only what had happened, but who each of them had become as a result. Itzel had to face a devastating moral conflict, feeling gratitude for those who raised her while simultaneously acknowledging the injustice committed. Conversations with her biological parents were marked by silence and tears. Elena and Arturo, for their part, struggled to balance their desire to make up for lost time with respect for their daughter's life. Little by little, the investigation revealed more than facts. It revealed intentions, weaknesses, and the power of suffering to shape choices. Marta wasn't a villain. She was a broken woman who, faced with chaos, had chosen the wrong path to rebuild her life. And as painful as it was, this truth demanded not only justice, bounds, but understanding. The healing process would be long. For Itzel, the truth was a cracked mirror. It reflected both the pain of a lost childhood and the genuine affection she had received from those who, paradoxically, had deprived her of her own story. For Arturo and Elena, the truth meant finally understanding the past, not to close it, but to begin to move forward from it. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, everyone realized that Itzel's story was not just about loss and deception, but also about the complex nature of human love, capable of wounding and healing at the same time. The reunion between Itzel and her biological family, though filled with emotion and hope, was only the first step in a much more complex process. After 18 years of separation, love wasn't enough to immediately fill the gap created by time. It was necessary to rebuild bonds, redefine roles, and, above all, understand that everyone had changed. The curious and talkative 7-year-old girl was now a 25-year-old woman, with fragmented memories, a new identity, and a past divided between two lives. Arturo and Elena welcomed her back with all possible care. In Mérida, they prepared Itzel's old room, preserved almost like a reliquary. The walls were still a pale blue, and on the dresser remained the small box of shells and stones she had collected as a child. When Itzel walked through the door and saw the untouched space, a lump formed in her throat. She touched the objects, one by one, as if groping for something familiar. The smell of the room, the light filtering through the window, the distant sounds of the city, everything seemed simultaneously close and strange. In the early days, the atmosphere was charged with pent-up emotion. Elena watched her daughter's every move with a mixture of joy and fear, trying not to be intrusive. Arturo, more reserved, seemed to struggle to balance happiness with the need to understand who the woman before him really was. Sophia, now a young adult, felt a mixture of affection, curiosity, and insecurity. For her, Itzel was an almost mythical figure, an absence transformed into an idealized memory. Having her back was wonderful, but also challenging. It was like living with a stranger who, somehow, had always been part of your story. The first few months were marked by prolonged silences and cautious dialogue. At the table, conversations revolved around neutral topics: work, the city, plans for the future. There was a fear of touching on open wounds. The family was wary of pressing her with questions, while Itzel, in turn, feared disappointing them with what she couldn't remember. Their time together was filled with small, tentative gestures. Elena would leave loving notes on the breakfast table. Arturo would invite her for short walks, trying to recreate old habits. And Sophia, with a shy smile, would show her childhood photos, trying to bridge the gaps between past and present. To facilitate her adaptation, Itzel began psychological counseling. A therapist specializing in family reintegration and trauma helped mediate tensions and guide the process of rediscovery. One of the main recommendations was to respect each person's pace and understand that emotional memory doesn't always accompany rational memory. There were memories Itzel could access clearly: the sound of the sea, her mother's touch combing her hair, her father's voice calling to her from the backyard. But others seemed blocked, as if hidden behind a thick fog. During the sessions, the psychologist used sensory evocation techniques. Smells, sounds, and images became tools for reconnection. In one session, Elena brought the perfume she used to wear when Itzel was a child. As soon as she opened the bottle, the young woman began to cry. She said the scent transported her to a place where she felt safe, even though she couldn't fully describe the scene. Another session used wave sounds recorded in Playa del Carmen. The effect was immediate. Itzel closed her eyes and, for a few moments, could visualize the beach, her small hands shaping sandcastles, and a distant voice calling her name. These moments, though moving, were also painful. Each recovered memory was accompanied by a sense of loss, the awareness of everything that had been erased and of the time that would never return. Elena and Arturo followed the process with patience, but also with anguish. They wanted their daughter back, but they realized that Itzel couldn't simply erase the life she had lived as Lucia. She carried with her the habits, values, and memories of another woman, Marta Garcia. This generated internal conflict and were at times our guilt. Sofia felt the emotional impact of this experience the most. The sister she had lost when she was 4 was now there, an adult Yair with her own story. In their first encounters, she found it difficult to call her sis. There was affection, but also an invisible distance. Over time, they began to find common ground. Itzel displayed a light sense of humor, similar to Sofia's, and a keen sensitivity to understanding emotions, perhaps an unconscious legacy of the loving environment in which she had been raised before her disappearance. The two began hanging out together, visiting cafes and sharing books. Sofia, a psychology student, used these conversations to better understand her sister's experience, but also to heal her own. It was a silent exchange, where each learned to respect the other's space. Still, there were moments of tension. Sofia sometimes felt jealous of the attention her parents gave their newly recovered daughter, while Itzel felt guilty for occupying a place that seemed not entirely hers. Arturo, for his part, became immersed in a kind of almost obsessive care. He began to follow Itzel's every step, fearing losing her again. This overprotectiveness, while understandable, caused discomfort. Once asked during a frank conversation, Itzel told him, "Father, I'm here, I'm back. But to stay, I need to be able to be myself." These words resonated deeply with him. They were a reminder that his daughter was not returning as a child to be protected, but as a woman who would need to build a new bond with them. As the months passed, progress became visible. Itzel began adopting the surname Morales Herrera on documents, but kept the name Lucia as part of her identity, a symbolic way of reconciling the two versions of herself. She gradually reconnected with Marta's old colleagues, visiting Puebla to revisit significant places and better understand that part of her history. These emotional journeys were difficult, but necessary to understand that the woman who had been her aunt had also been, in some way, a loving presence. At home, the routine was beginning to settle down. Elena prepared traditional dishes that Itzel had loved as a child, and the flavors seemed to trigger forgotten memories. One night, when she tasted the cochinita pibil, Itzel began to cry. She said the taste reminded her of something she couldn't describe, only feel. It was as if a piece of her childhood had finally found its way back. Little by little, the differences between past and present began to intertwine, forming a new shared history. There were still fears, hesitations, and the weight of nearly 2 decades lost, but there was also love, patience, and a genuine desire to rebuild what time had broken. Each recovered memory, each silent embrace, each evening conversation was a small step toward healing. The Morales Herrera family, now reunited, was learning to know each other again. They were no longer the same as before, but perhaps they had never been so truly united. There was still much to understand, and the shadows of the past continued to haunt them. But for the first time in 18 years, they were all walking side by side, trying to transform pain into a new beginning. When the Quintana Roo State Ministry of Justice officially declared the disappearance of Itzel Morales Herrera closed, the news carried the symbolic weight of something extremely rare, a case solved after nearly 2 decades. The final document, dated December 2015, classified the investigation as a successful resolution with family reunification. But between the lines, there was recognition of something much greater, the story of a family that refused to give in to oblivion and transformed pain into movement. The symbolic closing ceremony took place in Playa del Carmen, in the very place where it all began 18 years earlier. Commander Ramiro Soto, now retired, insisted on being present. He was the one who, in 1997, had coordinated the first searches and had never stopped following the case, even from afar. For him, it wasn't just about closing a case, but about celebrating a story that had taught him more than any police manual could. That morning, the sky was clear and the sea calm, a contrast to the restlessness that had gripped the atmosphere on the day of the disappearance. The gathering brought together not only the Morales Herrera family, but also longtime residents, fishermen, and local authorities. There was a respectful silence among those present. Elena held Itzel's hand tightly, while Arturo gazed at the horizon as if searching the waves for ghosts of the past. Commander Soto spoke with a firm but emotional voice. He said that the case had forever changed his view of police work. Here for years, and he stated, "We believed that investigations were conducted solely with evidence, reports, and protocols, but this case taught me that the strength of a family can be the most powerful element of all. Without their persistence, Itzel's story would have been shelved like so many others." He also made a point of highlighting the flaws revealed by the initial investigation, the lack of an integrated national missing persons system, the fragility of civil registration records, and the slowness of alert protocols had contributed to the girl's nearly 20-year absence from the radar. Based on this reflection, the commander participated in the creation of a technical report to be submitted to the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office, suggesting improvements in child search mechanisms and identity verification processes. The Morales case, as it came to be known internally, became a model for study in police academies, but the story transcended bureaucracy. In Merida, where the family was rebuilding their lives, the social impact was immediate. Newspapers, radio stations, and television programs began to address the issue in greater depth, highlighting the importance of perseverance and community solidarity in cases of disappearance. Elena and Arturo were invited to participate in conferences and meetings on human rights, disappearances, and emotional health. The couple accepted, not out of vanity, but out of the conviction that Itzel's story could help other families keep hope alive. Elena, with her experience in child psychology, began working directly with support groups for grieving parents. She developed emotional support workshops, in which she shared what she had learned about a suspended grief, the kind that has no body, no conclusion, and requires almost superhuman strength to resist. In her lectures, she repeated a phrase that would become symbolic of the case: "The absence of a child should never be confused with the end of a story. As long as there is love, there is continuity." Arturo, in turn, dedicated himself to the practical side. He created, in partnership with civil society organizations, a foundation dedicated to the search for and identification of missing persons. Named Huge Network, the institution was founded with the goal of uniting technology and humanity. It utilized genetic databases, cross-state sharing, and educational campaigns about minor registration. The project was recognized for its effectiveness and, within a few years, inspired similar initiatives in other regions of the country. Sophia, now a psychology graduate, contributed a scientific approach. Her master's thesis analyzed the psychological effects of prolonged disappearance on Latin American families and was published in academic journals. In the work, she described her own family's case under a pseudonym, highlighting how hope can function as a survival mechanism and also as an emotional anchor. The text concluded with a reflection that moved the evaluators. Reunion does not erase suffering, but transforms it into language. It is through storytelling that a family survives what seemed impossible. Itzel, for her part, decided to remain in Merida. She secured a transfer within the company where she worked and began collaborating on social programs for young people without a civil identity. She felt a need to give something back to the world that had found her again. Her presence at the Foundation's lectures and events was always remarkable. She spoke calmly, without dramatization, emphasizing that memory is not recovered simply by remembering, but by rebuilding the connection with the present. The Morales family's story became a national reference. At universities and schools, it began to be studied as an example of resilience and the transformation of suffering into social action. In 2016, the Yucatan state government passed a law inspired by the recommendations of Commander Soto's report, establishing a mandatory identity verification protocol for late birth registrations. The legal text explicitly mentioned the Morales Herrera case, recognizing its contribution to preventing fraud and disappearances. In the following years, new public campaigns emerged with the motto, "No search is in vain," a phrase Elena had repeated countless times in interviews. Social media, once a platform for false hope, now became tools for raising awareness. The We Search Itzel page remained active, but transformed into a space for mutual aid among families still searching for missing loved ones. Despite the recognition and tributes, Itzel avoided being seen as a heroic figure. In interviews, she spoke humbly about the duality of her existence. I was two people, and in a way, I still am, she said, but I learned that I don't need to choose between them. Itzel and Lucia coexist within me, as memories and as lessons learned. This vision, at once mature and sensitive, helped others understand the complexity of human identities marked by trauma and new beginnings. In Playa del Carmen, the site of the disappearance has been transformed into a small seaside memorial. A bronze plaque was installed at the exact spot where Itzel's sandal had been found, with the inscription, "Hope does not disappear with time, it becomes a path." The inauguration ceremony was attended by families of missing persons from across the country. Many brought flowers. Others simply remained silent. The story of the girl who disappeared at sea and returned almost 2 decades later no longer belonged solely to the Morales Herrera family. It had become a collective symbol, a living reminder that, even in the darkest situations, human persistence can overcome the impossible, and while time cannot restore what was lost, it can teach us how to transform pain into something that transcends life itself. The story of Itzel Morales Herrera goes beyond the confines of a simple case of disappearance and reunion. It is, above all, a profound reflection on human nature, on the power of memory, the strength of identity, and the capacity for reconstruction even in the face of loss. The journey of the girl who became Lucia and later rediscovered her true name reveals how memory is not just a memory, but also a root. Even without remembering her past, Itzel retained traces of who she was, her love for the sea, her curious gaze, the impulse to classify the world. These small remnants show that identity endures, even if time and trauma attempt to erase it. The story also exposes family resilience in the face of absence. Arturo, Elena, and Sofia lived years of waiting and uncertainty, sustained only by a thread of hope. With each day without answers, they reinvented ways to continue living and, in the process, discovered that love can persist even without presence, transforming into faith. The reunion didn't erase the pain, but it gave it new meaning. The family learned that suffering, when shared, can become a bridge instead of an abyss. Another essential theme is the moral ambiguity between love and error. Marta Garcia, by taking in the lost girl, committed an unjustifiable act, but one driven by a human need to fill the void left by her own pain. This contradiction reveals that not all errors arise from malice. Some arise from an inability to cope with suffering. The narrative, therefore, seeks not absolute culprits, but possible understandings. Hope emerges as the vital axis of the entire plot. Not a naive hope, but one that resists despair, transforming it into action. It's what keeps Arturo moving, Elena balanced, and Itzel searching for herself. Ultimately, the role of the community and institutions is remembered as indispensable. The collective support, the solidarity of neighbors, and the persistence of authorities who refuse to give up proved that the truth may take time, but it is never completely lost. Thus, Itzel Morales' story mirrors the most profound aspect of the human experience, the ability to lose everything and still continue to believe. She reminds us that each life is made of fragments, and that, with love and courage, it is possible to put them back together again. If this story moved you and made you reflect on the power of hope, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share this video with someone who also believes in the power of love and truth. Comment which country and city you're watching from, and tell us what touched you most about this journey. Stay with us, because real stories like this remind us that, even in darkness, light always finds a way.